My father is on his way here. I know this because I know him. He has never let go of anything he considers his own, not a piece of land, not a debt owed to him, not a daughter who ran before the sun came up on the morning of her own wedding. In the pocket of my dress there is a letter, a single page folded 3 times, the paper gone soft at the creases from how many times I have unfolded it and folded it back again. That letter could destroy him. It could also destroy the man sitting on the other side of this fire, the man who has not looked at me once in the last hour, but whose presence I feel the way you feel, a change in weather before the clouds arrive. I have not decided what to do with it yet, but for you to understand why I am still holding it, why I have not burned it or buried it or handed it over, you need to know how I came to be sitting in a Lakota camp in the Nebraska Territory in the autumn of 1878 with my father's sins folded up against my heart, and a man I have known for 6 weeks occupying more of my thoughts than any person has in my entire life. You need to know who I was before any of this began. So let me go back. Let me go back to Harrow's Bend. The town of Harrow's Bend sat in a shallow valley along the Elkhorn River, the kind of place that looked honest from a distance and revealed itself slowly the way a bruise does only after some time had passed and the colors had come fully to the surface. There was a general store, a livery, a jail that doubled as the marshal's office, 2 saloons that the Reverend pretended not to see, and a white clapboard church at the north end of Main Street where my father preached every Sunday morning to a congregation that believed he was a good man. Most of them were not wrong exactly. That is the part that made everything harder. Reverend Thomas Hallett was not a villain from a story. He did not have cold eyes or a cruel mouth. He was a tall man with large hands and a voice that could fill a room without effort, the kind of voice that made you feel when he directed it at you that you were the only person who mattered. When I was small and sat beside him in the pew during the week while he prepared his sermons, he would sometimes pause in his writing and look at me and smile, and that smile was real. I would have sworn then, and I would have sworn for years after that my father loved me. I think he did. I think love and harm are not always opposites. I think a person can love you genuinely and still make you smaller. Every year. Still teach you that your voice is secondary. Your needs are secondary. Your entire self is secondary. And call it protection while they do it. I think my father believed with his whole heart that everything he did for me was right. That belief was the cage I grew up in. I had learned to live in it the way you learn to breathe in a small room. You stop noticing the walls. You organize your life around the available space. You become skilled at not wanting what you cannot have, at not seeing what you have trained yourself not to see. By the time I was 22 years old, I had become so practiced at invisibility that most days I could not have told you what I myself thought about anything. My opinions had atrophied from disuse. My desires had gone so long without air that I had come to believe I simply did not have any. That was the person I was in the week before my wedding. Deputy Callum Strode had come to dinner at our house 4 times that month. He was a well-made man, broad through the shoulders, with a careful politeness that impressed everyone who saw it. He pulled out chairs. He waited for others to be served before he touched his own plate. He said the appropriate things at the appropriate moments, and his manners were so consistent and so correct that several women in town had told me privately how fortunate I was. I knew something they did not. The previous Tuesday evening, while my father was in his study and Callum and I were briefly alone in the front room, I had said I was tired and did not feel like sitting at the piano. It was a small thing. It was the smallest thing imaginable, and Callum had reached over and closed his hand around my wrist. Not violently. There was nothing you could have pointed to as violence, but with a pressure that was very deliberate and very clear, and he had looked at me with an expression of perfect pleasantness and said, "Why don't you play something anyway?" "Nora, I do enjoy listening to you." Then he had released my wrist and leaned back and smiled. Afterward he had asked if I was all right. His concern appeared genuine. I believe it was genuine. That was the thing about Callum Strode, that I would spend a long time learning to name the thing that made him more frightening than any man who simply announced his cruelty. He did not know what he had just done. He had squeezed my wrist and overridden my stated preference, and he had filed it in whatever part of himself kept such records under the category of love, under the category of caring for someone who needed direction. He was not pretending. That was the truth I had to live with. I did not sleep well in those days. I had not slept well in years. There is a particular kind of wakefulness that comes from living in a state of low, constant alertness, where you have learned to track footsteps through a wall and interpret the rhythm of another person's movements as either safe or unsafe. I had become expert at it. I knew my father's footsteps from the sound of his breathing when he was tired versus when he was troubled. I knew which floorboards to avoid. I knew how to make myself very still and very quiet and take up as little space as possible, and I had come to think of this skill as simply the way a person moved through the world. On the night before my wedding I could not sleep at all. I rose at some point past midnight when the house was fully dark and the only sound was my father's slow breathing through the wall. I needed water, that was all. I was not looking for anything. I moved through the dark house with the practiced silence of someone who had been doing it for years, past the kitchen, past the front room, and then because the lamp in my father's study had been left slightly on, casting a thin line of light under the door, I stopped. I do not know why I went in. I cannot explain it to you except to say that something in me, some part of me that had not yet been trained out of existence, pulled me toward that light the way a person in a dark house will move toward any window that offers a view of outside. His desk was neat. My father was always neat. Everything in its proper place, everything organized and labeled and correct. I was not searching. I was simply standing in the lamplight and letting myself exist in a room where I was not supposed to be, which was its own small rebellion. The letter was in the bottom drawer beneath his Bible. It was not hidden exactly. It was simply stored the way you store things you do not look at anymore but cannot bring yourself to throw away. A single page on United States Army letterhead dated November of 1873, signed by a Captain R. Morrison of the 5th Cavalry. I read it slowly twice. The language was formal and brief. It thanked my father for the information he had provided and noted that it had been used effectively. It referenced a campaign in the Elkhorn River country. It expressed confidence in the arrangement going forward and reminded my father that their correspondence was to be kept in confidence in the interest of ongoing operations in the territory. I stood in the lamplight for a long time after I finished reading. I did not understand it fully. I want to be honest about that. There were things I could not yet name or place. But there was something in the word campaign, something in the phrase used effectively, something in the way the letter had been buried beneath a Bible, and a man's careful silence for 5 years, that sat in my stomach like a stone I had swallowed and could not pass. I thought about the stories I had heard over the years, fragments of things people said, and then quieted when they noticed me listening. A winter 5 years ago when something had happened to a settlement of Indians along the Elkhorn. People spoke of it the way they spoke of storms or floods, as a natural thing, a thing without specific names attached, without specific faces. I had accepted this the way I accepted everything, without pressing further, without wanting to know more than I was given. Standing in my father's study at midnight with his letter in my hands, I understood for the first time that I had been accepting it deliberately, that I had been trained to accept it, that the not knowing had been something I had been taught to choose. I took the letter. I do not know what I intended to do with it. I cannot tell you I had a plan, because I did not. I only knew with a certainty that bypassed thought entirely and lived somewhere in the body that the letter should not remain in the keeping of the man who had received it, that whatever it meant it should not stay buried beneath his Bible for another 5 years. I went back to my room. I dressed in the dark. I put the letter inside my dress against my skin, where I could feel the paper with each breath. I tied my hair back with a strip of cloth, and I picked up my shoes, and I walked out of my father's house through the kitchen door, which I had left unlocked the night before without knowing why, and I did not look back. The Nebraska sky in September at 3 in the morning is something I will carry with me the rest of my life. Stars so dense and so close that the sky looks crowded with them, like a field after heavy rain when every surface is silver. The grass smelled of dry earth and sage and something faintly sweet that I had no name for. My feet found the ground, and I walked north without a specific destination, only north away from the town and the church and the man who would be looking for me in a few hours. I walked until I could no longer see the lights of Harrow's Bend, and then I stopped. I do not know how long I stood there in the dark. Long enough for my breathing to slow, long enough for the adrenaline that had carried me out of the house to begin to fade and leave behind something quieter and colder. I looked down. At my feet, just visible in the starlight, there was a small flower growing up through the dry grass. A prairie aster, pale yellow, the kind of thing that grows everywhere in Nebraska and that no one stops to look at because it is ordinary and unremarkable and there is always somewhere else to be. I had never stopped to look at one. The thought arrived without fanfare, without drama. I had never once in my life stopped in the middle of a path to look at a flower simply because it was there and I wanted to look at it. Every moment of my existence had been organized around what was expected, what was required, what would be approved of. My wants had been categorized years ago under the heading of secondary, and I had accepted the categorization so completely that I had stopped being able to locate them. And here was this flower that served no purpose I could name, that nobody had planted or tended or asked to be there, that was simply existing in the dark Nebraska grass because that was what it was made to do. I stood there until the sky began to lighten in the east. When it was light enough to see, I lifted my head and found that I was not alone. He was to the north of me, not the south, not between me and the town. That was the first thing I registered, that this was not someone who had followed me. He was already here, sitting on a painted horse at the crest of a low rise, still and watchful as a hawk on a fence post, studying me with an expression I could not read at that distance. I reached into my dress for the letter before I had consciously decided to do it. My fingers found the folded paper and stayed there. Because I had just remembered something. The letter from Captain Morrison had referenced a campaign in the Elkhorn River country. It had referenced a settlement. And the man on the painted horse had come from the north, which was the direction of the Elkhorn River country, and he was Lakota, and I was standing in the grass with my father's correspondence pressed against my skin, and the slow, terrible arithmetic of it was beginning to arrive. If this was the band that lived near Harrow's Bend in the Elkhorn River country in the autumn of 1873, if this was the band that Captain Morrison's letter described as a campaign, then the man watching me from the rise was not a stranger to what my father had done. I did not run. I want to tell you it was because I was brave, but the truth is simpler than that. My feet did not know which direction was safe anymore. I had fled south my entire life, and south had never been safe. North was unknown, but it was at least unknown on my own terms, which was something I had not had before. I stood in the grass with the letter against my heart, and I waited to see what would happen next. He did not rush toward me. He did not call out. He simply sat on his horse and watched me for another long moment, and then he began to ride slowly in my direction, and I made myself hold still. That was the first morning of the rest of my life. I did not know it yet. I only knew that somewhere behind me my father would wake to find his letter gone and his daughter gone, and somewhere ahead of me, past the man on the painted horse, the Nebraska territory stretched north toward a horizon I had never seen. I was terrified. I was for the first time in 22 years entirely free. Both of those things were true at once. That surprised me. I had not known they could be. He stopped his horse 10 feet from me and did not come any closer. That was the second thing I noticed about him after the direction he had come from. He left space. He did not use his size or his horse or his approach to close the distance between us before I had chosen to close it. He simply stopped and looked at me and waited, and I had so little experience with that particular behavior in a man that I did not immediately recognize it for what it was. He was tall in the saddle, lean but solid, the way a cottonwood tree is solid, something that bends in weather but does not come down. His hair was black and worn loose around his shoulders. He had a long scar above his left eye, pale and old, running up into his hairline. His hands were resting easy on the pommel of his saddle, not reaching for anything. He looked at me the way you look at something you are trying to understand, not to possess. I had not been looked at that way before. He said something I did not expect. Not "Where are you going?" Not "What are you doing out here?" not are you lost. He said, "What is your name?" Just that, as though the answer mattered for its own sake and for no other reason. "My name is Nora," I said. "Nora Hallett. My father called me daughter. Callum called me sweetheart. And before that, in the early days of the arrangement, he had called me Miss Hallett, which had felt like a category rather than a name. The congregation called me the Reverend's girl. I had been named by other people's needs for so long that hearing my own name come out of my own mouth felt strange, like speaking a word in a language you have not used in years and finding it still there. "Nora," the man said. He said it carefully as though he were checking the weight of it. Then he said, "Are you hurt?" Not "Where did you come from?" Not "Whose are you?" "Are you hurt?" Something moved in my chest. I cannot describe it better than that. Something that had been held in a particular position for a very long time shifted slightly the way a door moves when you take your shoulder away from it. "I am all right," I said, which was not true and was also in the way that counted most entirely true. He dismounted in one motion and came toward me, and I made myself stand still, which took more effort than I would like to admit. He crouched in front of me and looked at my feet without touching them, and then he looked up at me and said, "May I?" and gestured at my left foot, which was bleeding through the torn hem of my dress from where I had walked on something in the dark. The asking, the waiting. I sat down in the grass and let him look at my foot. He had a leather bag on his horse, the kind that looked like it had been packed and unpacked 1,000 times. He came back with a strip of soft doeskin and a small water skin, and he cleaned the cut with the water first, his hands competent and light, neither rough nor overly tender, the hands of someone who had dressed injuries many times and understood that pain should not be added to pain. While he worked, I noticed the scar on his left wrist. Not a knife wound, not a battle scar. The kind of mark that comes from binding from something wound too tight for too long. I did not ask about it. It was not my question to ask. But I stored it away the way you store things you know will matter later. "I speak English," he said without looking up from his work, in case you were wondering. I said. My mother was white. She taught me. He wrapped the doeskin around my foot with 2 neat turns and tucked the end under. His name, he told me, was Daniel Sleeping Bear. I want to tell you what happened next in the order that it actually happened, which is not the order in which I understood it. What happened is that Daniel finished wrapping my foot and sat back on his heels and looked at me with that same level reading expression and said, "Where are you going?" And I said, "North." And he said, "That is where I am going as well." And then he said, "I can bring you somewhere safe. You do not have to stay. You can leave whenever you choose." I sat in the grass with my wrapped foot and the letter against my skin and looked at this man who had asked my name and waited for my answer and dressed my wound without being asked and offered me a choice, an actual choice presented plainly without any condition attached to it. And I thought about my father's house and Callum's hand on my wrist and the word campaign in a letter filed under a Bible. I thought about the flower in the dark. I stood up. He offered his hand and I took it, and he helped me to my feet in a manner that was entirely straightforward, and then he stepped back and gave me the space again, that careful, consistent space, and I understood that this was not an accident. He was doing it deliberately. He knew what he was doing. I climbed onto his horse. He took the reins and began to walk north, leading us at a pace that was easy and quiet, and I sat in the saddle and watched the Nebraska morning arrive around us in shades of amber and pale gold, and for the first time in as long as I could remember, I did not feel the need to brace for what was coming. We rode in silence for a long time, the kind of silence that is not uncomfortable because neither person is trying to fill it. Daniel walked steadily, occasionally checking the horizon in all directions, with a scan that was automatic and efficient, the habit of a man who had learned to watch his surroundings not from anxiety, but from necessity. Once he pointed to a place in the grass 30 feet to our left and said, "Antelope, 2 of them, young, bedded down for the night and still sleeping." I looked and could not see them until I looked the way he was pointing, and then I saw the slight movements of breath in the grass, the small disruptions of 2 living things tucked into the landscape. He had shown me something not because I needed to know it, but because it was there, and he thought I might want to see it. I catalogued that as well. When he mentioned what he was bringing me to a camp, his people, he said it without ornament or apology. He told me his uncle was the chief. He told me there were women who would give me proper clothes for the weather. He told me again that I was not obligated to stay. I thought about what I had been taught concerning Indians. I am not going to pretend I had not been taught what everyone in Harrow's Bend had been taught, because I had. I had grown up on those stories, the raids and the danger and the savagery, the language that made an entire people into something other than people. I had absorbed it the way you absorb everything in the house you grow up in, without examining it, without holding it to the light to see what it was made of. But I was also sitting on this man's horse, with this man's careful bandaging around my foot, and he had asked my name and waited for my permission and walked north in the early morning light without demanding anything from me in return. And I thought with a clarity that surprised me that the people who had taught me those stories were the same people who had taught me to stay in a house where I was frightened. They were the same people who had told me that Callum Strode's hand around my wrist was love. They were the same people under whose direction my father had written a letter to a cavalry captain and called it something other than what it was. Maybe I thought. Maybe the instruction manual I had been given for reading the world was not as reliable as I had been told it was. We arrived at the camp in the late morning. I will not try to describe my first impression of it in a way that makes it simple, because it was not simple. It was busy and loud and full of movement, children running, dogs investigating, women doing work with the focused efficiency of people who understand that there is always more work to be done. There was smoke from cooking fires and the smell of cured hide and wood smoke, and there was a solidity to it that I had not expected, a sense of a community that knew itself, that had its own logic and its own order that I did not yet have the language to read. People noticed me immediately. That was unavoidable. A white woman on a Lakota horse in a ruined dress with doeskin wrapped around her feet was not an ordinary arrival. There were looks. Some of them were wary, and some of them were curious, and some of them were openly skeptical, and I understood all of those responses as entirely reasonable. A man came forward to meet us, who I understood immediately was the chief, not from any outward ceremony, but simply from the way the space around him organized itself. He was older, perhaps 60, with a face that had weathered into a kind of permanent stillness. He and Daniel spoke in Lakota for several minutes. I stood beside the horse and waited. Then Daniel turned to me and said, "My uncle says you are welcome here. He says you may stay as long as you need. He asks only that you respect the camp and the people in it." "I will," I said. Daniel's uncle looked at me for a moment. Then he said something in Lakota that Daniel translated without expression. He says he hopes you find what you are looking for. I did not know how to answer that, partly because I did not yet know what I was looking for, and partly because no one had asked me a question like that in so long that I had lost the habit of knowing how to locate the answer. That afternoon they gave me a lodge to rest in, and a woman named Sage Woman came to bring me food and clothes. She was perhaps 50, with gray beginning in her hair and eyes that moved over me in a manner that was assessing, but not unkind. She handed me a dress of soft deer hide and a pair of moccasins and a strip of cloth for my hair, and she did not ask me anything or require anything of me, and when I had changed, she looked at me and nodded once as though something had been confirmed for her. Later I would understand that she had lost a son 5 years ago, and that she did not hate me for being white, and she did not welcome me because she had forgiven anything. She simply saw me. That was rarer than I knew how to say. I saw the young man watching me that afternoon. He was perhaps 19, with the kind of stillness that is not peaceful, but coiled a person at rest, the way a spring is at rest. He stood at the edge of the common area and watched me with an expression that was neither hostile nor friendly. It was calculating. He was adding something up. He did not approach. He just watched, and then he moved away, and for a reason I could not name, I tracked him across the camp until he disappeared between two lodges. That night I lay in the lodge they had given me. The fire outside had burned down to coals, and the camp was quiet around me, the deep quiet of people who had spent the day in physical labor and were sleeping with the thoroughness of the genuinely tired. There were no footsteps in the hall to interpret, no wall between me and the next room through which I needed to listen. No particular shape of silence that I had to read for safety or danger. just the sound of the wind in the grass and somewhere distant something moving through it, an animal going about the business of its night, and a low voice singing in the camp. Someone still awake, the melody shapeless and old, and not meant for me but drifting through the dark toward me anyway. I waited for the familiar dread to arrive, the tightening in my chest that had been my constant companion for as long as I could remember. The bracing against whatever came next. It did not come. The absence of it was so foreign that it took me a long time to recognize it for what it was. And when I did, when I understood that what I was feeling in my chest was not dread, but simply the absence of dread, a plain and ordinary quiet, I lay in the dark, and I let myself cry. Not for Harrow's Bend, not for my father, not even for the girl I had been in that house for 22 years. I cried because I had not known until that moment how tired I was. How much of myself had been spent on the maintenance of vigilance, on the constant low work of existing in a state of readiness for harm, and how long I had done it without understanding that there was any other way to live. And then the crying stopped the way things stop when they have said what they needed to say, and I put my hand over the pocket where I had stored the letter, and I felt the shape of it through the cloth, and I thought about what Daniel had told me without knowing he was telling me anything. A preacher, he had said, not yet knowing the man's name, not yet knowing I was carrying the proof of it against my skin, not yet knowing the man's name, not yet knowing I was carrying the proof of it against my skin. I had come north to escape my father's house. I had arrived in the one place in the territory where his shadow was longest. I lay in the dark for a long time after that, looking up at the lodge ceiling and listening to the wind and the distant singing and thinking about what it meant to carry a secret that was not yours, and what it cost to keep it, and what it might cost to let it go. Outside, someone added wood to a dying fire. The flames caught and steadied, and a thin line of firelight came under the edge of the lodge covering and lay across the floor near my feet. I watched it until I slept. 3 weeks passed the way water passes over stone, quietly and with accumulation. I learned things in those weeks that I had no names for, yet things that arrived not as lessons, but as small revisions to what I thought I understood about how a life could be organized. I learned that there was a particular satisfaction in physical work that produced a visible result in a hide that went from rough to smooth under your hands, in a stitch that held in a fire that caught on the first strike of flint. I had kept house for my father for years, but that had always felt like maintenance, like the constant labor of preventing things from getting worse, never the labor of building something new. Here the work felt different. Here the work accumulated into something. Sage Woman taught me in the mornings. She was not an easy teacher, not in the way I had expected. She did not speak slowly or simplify her explanations or treat my ignorance as something requiring gentleness. She treated it as simply a condition to be corrected the way you would treat a tool that needs sharpening with patience and repetition, but without apology for the effort required. She showed me how to hold the scraping tool against the hide at the angle that removed flesh without tearing the skin beneath it. She showed me twice. The third time she stepped back and watched me with her arms folded and let me figure out what I was doing wrong. I ruined the first piece I worked alone. She looked at the damage and said, "Try again," and handed me another piece. I ruined the second one less badly. By the end of the first week, my hands had developed blisters and then calluses over the blisters, and I could feel the difference between a hide that was ready for the next stage and one that needed more work, the way you eventually learn to feel anything with enough repetition, not by thinking about it, but through the skin. While she taught me, she talked. Not to me exactly. She talked the way some people pray aloud and with commitment, but not necessarily requiring a listener. She talked about the work, about the materials, about the season, and what it required. And sometimes, without transition or warning, she would say something about the camp, about a winter that had been particularly hard, about a summer of good hunting, about a child who had been sick and then recovered. She talked around the edges of 1873, the way you talk around a wound that is still healing, circling it without touching it, describing its shape by describing everything around it. I listened. I was becoming good at listening in a different way than I had practiced before. Before listening had been surveillance. Listening had been the tracking of tone and mood and implication, the constant reading of other people's states for signs of what was coming. This was different. This was simply taking in what was offered without immediately calculating what it meant for my own safety. It was harder than it sounds. The old habit ran very deep. In the afternoons, Daniel found me. He did not announce this arrangement or suggest it. It simply began to happen the way many things in those weeks began to happen, through a kind of natural gravity rather than explicit plan. He would appear at the edge of whatever I was doing and stand there a moment, and then we would walk out of the camp together and he would begin to teach. He taught the way he did everything with economy and precision and without condescension. He pointed to marks in the earth and waited for me to identify what had made them before he confirmed or corrected. He named things in Lakota first and English second, not to confuse me, but because he said the Lakota word is often closer to what the thing actually is. He was right about that in ways I could not always articulate, but could feel in the distinction the difference between a language built to categorize and a language built to describe. I began to understand something about Daniel's sleeping bear in those afternoons that I had not understood before. He was tired. Not physically, though the life he led was physically demanding in ways that mine had never been. He was tired in the way a person is tired when they have been required for years to translate between two worlds that do not understand each other, to stand in the space between them and render each legible to the other and absorb the friction of the gap. He spoke English with a fluency that came from necessity, and he carried it like a second weight, something he had taken on because he had to, and that had not gotten lighter with time. He almost never spoke about himself directly. I learned him the way you learn a landscape, by moving through it and paying attention to what the terrain tells you. I learned that he had been the one his uncle sent to negotiate with the army twice before 1873. I learned that he had a younger brother who had died of fever when they were both children, and that this loss had shaped him in ways he did not name, but that were visible in how he watched the children in the camp, a particular quality of attention that was partly protective and partly something else, something that recognized in each of them a vulnerability that the world did not reliably honor. I learned that he had been married. He did not tell me this directly either. It emerged from context, from the way certain spaces in his lodge were arranged, from the way Sagewoman once referenced something his wife had made, correcting herself mid-sentence when she noticed me listening, from the way he sometimes went still in the middle of a sentence, as though he had bumped against something in the dark and was waiting for the pain to clarify. His wife's name I learned later. That night, the 19th night at the creek, we had spent the afternoon tracking a small herd of deer through broken country south of the camp, not to hunt, Daniel had made clear, but to practice reading what the land recorded. The exercise was harder than it sounded because I kept looking for large, obvious signs, disturbed ground, broken branches, and he kept directing my attention to smaller things, a smear of moisture on a flat stone, a depression in a patch of soft ground no larger than my palm, the way a clump of grass was bent in a direction that differed from its neighbors by a few degrees. "You are looking for proof," he told me, "when what you need to do is read the story." We had turned back toward camp as the sun began to drop toward the horizon and the light went amber and long across the grass. At the creek he stopped and sat down on a flat rock at the water's edge, and I sat beside him and we watched the current for a while without speaking. He had a piece of wood in his hands, a branch no longer than his forearm, and he was carving it with a small knife, his hands moving with the automatic ease of someone doing something they have done 10,000 times. He was not paying attention to the work. He was somewhere else entirely. I looked at what he was carving. It was a bird. Small and simple, each stroke of the knife precise and economical. The same shape as the carving he wore on a leather cord around his neck, the one he never removed. I did not ask. I had learned by then that the questions that mattered most with Daniel were the ones you did not ask, that he answered them in his own time or not at all, and that either was his right. After a long time he said my wife used to sing when she worked. He did not look at me when he said it. He was watching the creek. Not out loud, he continued, just to herself, just quietly, like she was not aware she was doing it. I heard it every day for 4 years. He stopped. The knife moved once more across the wood and then was still. Now the days are too quiet, he said. I sat with that for a moment. The creek moved over its stones. A red-winged blackbird called from the reeds across the water, and then was silent. "The person who took that from you," I said, and I was careful with the words, kept my voice level and my eyes on the water. "You said you knew something about them, about who it was." He was quiet for long enough that I thought he would not answer. "I know enough," he said finally. "A preacher, a white preacher who passed information about where we were to the soldiers. His name I do not have, but names can be found." In the pocket of my dress, folded 3 times soft at the creases, the letter weighed more than paper should. I did not sleep that night. I lay in my lodge and looked at the ceiling and held the letter in my hands in the dark and turned it over and over without opening it, the way you handle something you know is hot before you have made yourself ready to touch it directly. The facts organized themselves in my mind with a terrible patience. My father's letter, Captain Morrison's acknowledgment, the campaign in the Elkhorn River country, the autumn of 1873. Daniel's wife singing quietly to herself in the mornings of a life that had ended on a day when the cavalry had known exactly where to come. The arithmetic was not complicated. What was complicated was what you did with it once you had added it up. If I told Daniel what I knew, what I was holding, the shape of the thing would change immediately, and I could not predict how. Daniel was not a violent man in the casual sense of the word. He was precise and deliberate, and he thought before he acted. I had seen enough of him by then to know that much. But he was also a man who had been living for 5 years alongside an absence that had a shape and a cause, a man who had said with the quietness of someone stating a fact rather than making a threat, "Names can be found." And my father was coming. I knew this the way you know things about the people who made you in the bone rather than the mind. He would not leave me out here. He would not write me off and go back to his life and his congregation. He was on his way here, and when he arrived, Daniel would see his face would eventually in some way or another arrive at the truth, and then I would lose whatever small ability I had to shape what happened next. But there was another possibility sitting beside the first one that I had not let myself examine directly yet. I could wait. I could not tell Daniel. I could burn the letter or bury it in the grass and let it be someone else's story, someone else's reckoning. I could be the daughter who ran away and found safety, and did not complicate that safety with the weight of what her father had done. I could be grateful for what I had been given and repay it with silence. I had been repaying things with silence my entire life. The thought arrived and did not leave. I was still turning the letter over in my hands when I heard something outside. Not a threat, just movement, the particular quality of deliberate footsteps that are trying not to wake anyone. I lay still and listened, and after a moment I heard it again, someone walking the perimeter of the camp in the careful pattern of someone keeping watch. Daniel, walking the camp in the dark the way he walked the afternoons, with his attention fully given to what he was doing, with a thoroughness that did not spare itself even when no one was watching. I lay in the dark and listened to his footsteps make one slow circuit and then another, steady and unhurried, and something in the rhythm of them worked on me the way water works on stone, not breaking anything, just wearing a particular shape into the resistance. I had carried other people's silences for 22 years. I had accepted the silences they required of me, and I had maintained them at cost to myself. And I had called this loyalty because I had been given no other word for it. This was different. This was not my silence to keep. I put the letter back in my dress and closed my eyes, and I did not decide anything yet. But I felt the decision beginning to form in the dark, the way a horizon forms before the light arrives, not visible yet, but present, an imminence you can feel in the air before you can see it in the sky. I put the letter back in my dress and closed my eyes. Outside, Daniel's footsteps made one more slow circuit of the camp and then went still. I lay in the dark and listened to the silence he left behind, and I understood that the decision I had been avoiding was not a decision at all anymore. It was simply the next thing I was going to do. I found her before the camp was fully awake, sitting outside her lodge with a basket she was repairing, her fingers working the reeds with the automatic confidence of someone whose hands know the work well enough that the mind can be elsewhere. She looked up when I approached and then looked back at her basket, which was her way of saying she would hear me but would not make a ceremony of it. I sat down beside her. "I have something to show you," I said. "I need you to look at it and tell me what you know." She put the basket in her lap and waited. I took the letter out and unfolded it carefully and held it where she could see it. She could not read English, I knew that. What I needed her to see was the letterhead, the official seal of the United States Army 5th Cavalry, and the signature at the bottom. Captain R. Morrison. She looked at the paper for a long time without speaking. I watched her face. Her expression did not change in the way that an expression changes when something is new. It changed in the way it changes when something is old, when you encounter again something you have already spent years carrying, and the encounter costs you the effort of lifting it again into the present moment where it has to be looked at once more. She reached out and touched the seal at the top of the page. Not the letters, just the seal, the embossed shape of it. "I know this mark," she said. Her voice was the same as it always was, level and without effect. But there was something underneath it that I had not heard before, the particular weight of a person choosing their words, not for effect but for accuracy, because the thing they are describing requires accurate words. "There was a man," she said. "A white man. He came to the camp in the autumn before the soldiers came. He said he was a man of God. He spoke with my husband, with the chief, with the families. He was here for 3 days. He ate our food and he slept under our roofs and he prayed over our children." She stopped. "When the soldiers came," she said, "they came before dawn, which is the hour when soldiers come when they do not want to give you time to run. I saw this man standing at the edge of things, not with the soldiers, not holding a weapon, just standing, watching, with this mark on the papers he carried in his coat." She tapped the seal once more and then withdrew her hand. "I did not see his face well enough to know it again," she said. "It was dark and I was trying to get the children away from the horses, but I heard his voice. He spoke English to the soldiers, and I did not understand all of it, but I heard one thing clearly. He said, 'This is the one,' or words close to that, as though he were showing them something he had found and was confirming it was what they were looking for." She picked up her basket and resumed her work. She did not ask me whose letter it was. Perhaps she already knew or suspected. Perhaps she was giving me the space to arrive at what I needed to do without being pushed toward it, in the way that she seemed to understand instinctively that certain things a person has to choose for themselves or they do not count. I sat beside her for a while after she stopped speaking in the morning quiet of the camp coming to life around us. I thought about my father in his study composing his reports for Captain Morrison by lamplight, writing in his careful handwriting about the location of a camp, the number of people, the patterns of their movement. I thought about what he had told himself while he wrote. I thought about the way a person can talk themselves into almost anything if they are frightened enough and if the thing they are talking themselves into serves their fear well enough. My father had been afraid of this land, of the uncertainty of building a life in a territory that felt contested and dangerous. He had wanted security. He had wanted the ground under his feet to feel permanent. He had purchased that permanence with information that cost him nothing and cost others everything. And then he had gone home and delivered his sermons and raised his daughter to be quiet and to ask no questions that inconvenienced the people around her. "I am going to tell Daniel," I said. Sagewoman's hands did not pause in their work. "I know," she said. I stood up. And then she said something I had not expected, something that stopped me and made me turn back toward her. She said, "The man who came to our camp, he had a daughter. I remember because he spoke of her. He said he was building something here for her future. He said everything he did was for her sake." She looked up at me then for the first time since we had started talking. "I thought you should know that," she said. "What a person tells themselves about why they do a thing is not always a lie. Sometimes it is the truest thing they believe, and sometimes the truest thing a person believes is still wrong." I walked away from her lodge and stood in the middle of the camp with the morning sun coming in low and flat from the east, painting everything amber and gold, and I understood that she was not excusing my father. She was doing something harder than that, She was insisting on his full humanity, on the complete picture of him, the frightened man who loved his daughter, and the man who had stood at the edge of a burning camp and called it necessary. And she was insisting on both of those things being true at once, because that was the actual shape of it. And looking away from any part of the shape would not change the shape. I put my hand over the letter in my pocket. I had thought this was going to get simpler as I went. I understood now that it was not. It was then that I became aware of someone behind me. I turned and found the young man, young Hawk, standing perhaps 6 feet away, watching me with the same calculating stillness I had noticed on my first day. Up close, he looked younger than I had initially estimated, and older than that at the same time, the particular combination you see in people who have had to grow up faster than the calendar allowed. He said, "I need to speak with you." I waited. He looked around the camp, a quick professional assessment of who was within hearing distance, and then he looked back at me and said, "I know who your father is." The morning seemed to go very still around me. "I have a cousin," he said, "who lives near Harrow's Bend. He works at the livery there. He has told me things over the years, things people say when they think a stable hand is not listening. He told me about the Reverend and what he did in 1873. He told me the man's name was Hallett." He paused. "When you arrived here," he said, "I recognized your name. Why did you not tell Daniel?" I said. My voice sounded steadier than I felt. Young Hawk's jaw tightened. He was quiet for a moment in the way someone is quiet when they are choosing between several honest answers and trying to identify the most accurate one. "Because Daniel would act," he said finally. "And when Daniel acts, my uncle has to respond. And when my uncle responds, the army has a reason to come here and do what armies do when they have a reason. I have seen it happen to other camps. The pattern is always the same. Someone gives them a reason, and then they use the reason, and the reason grows until it is larger than anything that started it." He looked at me steadily. "But I also cannot be silent forever. What was done here deserves to be answered. The people who died here deserve to have someone answer for it." He stopped. "I need you to understand that I am not asking for your permission. I am telling you that I have been waiting. I am waiting because I believe there is a way to do this that does not destroy what I am trying to protect. But I need someone who can reach your father in a way that I cannot reach him." He looked at the pocket where I kept the letter. "Do you have something?" he said. I took the letter out and held it toward him. He looked at it without taking it. He studied the letterhead and the official seal and Morrison's signature, and he nodded once, a short, controlled movement. "Keep it," he said. "That belongs with you." He turned to go, and then stopped and faced me again with an expression that had lost some of its calculation and gained something more unguarded, something that looked like it cost him to show. "My mother was in this camp in 1873, he said. "She was not hurt, but she was here. She has not slept through the night since then." He walked away. I stood in the middle of the camp with the letter in my hand and the sun coming up around me and the weight of everything I knew pressing down on the morning with a steadiness that was almost physical. My father was coming. I had known it from the moment I woke up in a place that felt safe and understood in the way you understand things about the people who made you that safety. This complete would eventually draw him here because he would read it as theft. He would read my absence as something taken from him rather than something I had chosen for myself. And Daniel did not know. I found him at the edge of the camp near the horses, checking the tack on his mare with the focused attention he brought to everything practical. He heard me coming and looked up. I stood in front of him, and I took the letter out one final time, and I held it toward him, and I said I found this in my father's desk the night I left. I brought it because I did not know what it was. I know now what it is. He looked at the letter in my hand. He did not take it immediately. He looked at my face first, reading it the way he read tracks in the earth, carefully looking for what the surface was telling him about what lay beneath. Then he took it. I watched him read it. I watched the stillness in his face, which was always considerable, become a different kind of stillness, the kind that is not calm, but the suspension of something very large that is deciding whether to move. He read it twice, the same way I had read it the first time, because the first time your mind cannot quite take in what it is being shown. Then he lowered the paper. He did not look at me. He looked at something past me in the middle distance where there was nothing to look at except the open prairie and the sky above it. I said I did not know when I took it. I put it together over time. Sage Woman confirmed it this morning. She was here. She saw the seal. Daniel said nothing. I said, I do not know what you want to do with this. I do not know if there is anything to do, but it is not mine to keep, and it is not mine to decide. It is yours. He was quiet for so long that I began to wonder if he would speak at all, if this was something so large that it had taken him somewhere beyond words, somewhere that words could not reach. Then he said, Your father, he is coming here. It was not a question. Yes, I said. He looked at the letter once more, and then he folded it the 3 familiar folds and held it in his closed hand. He said, I need to think. He walked away towards the open ground south of the camp, and I let him go because there are things a person has to do alone, and this was one of them, and because I had done the thing I had decided to do, and the shape of what happened next was no longer entirely mine to determine. I went back to the lodge they had given me, and I sat on the ground inside it with my back against the wall and my knees drawn up, and I waited. Outside I could hear the camp moving around its ordinary business children and dogs, and the sound of work being done. In a lodge not far away someone was singing the same low, shapeless melody I had heard on my first night, the one that was not meant for me but had reached me anyway. I thought about what Sage Woman had said, that the truest thing a person believes can still be wrong. I thought about my father by lamplight writing his careful reports, telling himself it was for my future, for the permanence of something I could inherit, and I thought about how that story must have felt to him from the inside, how it must have felt like love. I thought about the 19 nights I had been here. I thought about Daniel's hands cleaning a wound without adding to it, about the letter in his closed fist. I thought about my mother's voice, which I barely remembered anymore, just the quality of it, the specific warmth of it, and how long it had been since anyone had spoken to me in a voice that had that quality. I heard the dogs begin to bark. Not the ordinary bark of greeting, not the sound they made when a familiar person came back into camp. The other sound. The sound that meant something unknown was arriving from outside. I stood up. I knew before I reached the door of the lodge. I knew from the way the dogs sounded and from the direction the commotion was coming from, which was south, which was the direction of Harrow's Bend. I pulled the flap aside and stepped out into the afternoon light. And there at the southern edge of the camp, where Chief Tall River and 3 of his men were already standing, were 5 horses and 5 riders. My father sat in the lead. Beside him on a gray horse was Callum Strode. My father looked older in the afternoon light than he had looked when I left, which was something I had not expected, though. I understood immediately that it was not time that had aged him, but something else. He looked like a man who had not slept well. He looked like a man who had been trying to outrun something, and had not managed to outrun it, and had arrived anyway. His eyes found me immediately. I did not look away. And I understood something in that moment that I had not understood before, standing in the camp with my wrapped feet on the ground and a borrowed dress on my back, and everything I had been and everything I was becoming existing in the same body at the same time. I was not going back. Not because I was angry, though I was. Not because I was frightened, though some residue of the old fear moved through me at the sight of him. But because I had stood in a field in the dark and looked at a flower and asked myself what I wanted, and the question had turned out to be the beginning of an answer, and the answer was this place, this ground, these people who had given me something I did not have a word for yet, but that I felt in my bones as clearly as I felt the prairie wind. My father opened his mouth to speak. I took a step forward. I was the one who spoke first. My father had always been the one who spoke first. In every room he had ever entered, in every conversation he had ever been part of, in every moment of tension or negotiation or quiet domestic reckoning around the dinner table of our house in Harrow's Bend. Thomas Hallett had been the one who set the terms. He had the voice for it, that deep, unhurried voice that filled whatever space it entered and made other voices feel like interruptions by comparison. He had the bearing for it, the height and the stillness, and the particular quality of attention that made people feel, when he directed it at them, that they were being assessed by something larger than a single man. I had spent 22 years waiting for him to finish speaking before I was allowed to begin. I took one step forward and I said before he could open his mouth fully, "I know what you did." The camp went very quiet around me. Not silent. The wind was still moving through the grass at the camp's edge, and the horses were still shifting their weight and breathing. But the human noise of the place, the low conversations and the sounds of work, all of that dropped away as though the air itself had decided to listen. My father sat on his horse and looked at me, and the expression on his face was not the one I had expected. I had expected anger. I had prepared myself for the version of him that I knew best in moments of challenge, the version that drew itself up and became formal and certain, and spoke in the cadences of a man who has the authority of God and the law and custom behind him, and knows it. I had braced for that version of him the way you brace for weather you have seen before and know how to read. What I saw instead was something I had never seen on his face in my entire life. He was afraid. Not of the camp or the warriors standing at the perimeter or the arrows that could have been nocked and were not. He was afraid of me, of what I knew and what I was about to say, and the particular way that a truth once spoken aloud in front of witnesses cannot be put back into the drawer it came from. Behind me, I heard Daniel's footsteps. He had come back from the open ground and was standing perhaps 10 feet behind me. I did not turn to look at him. I kept my eyes on my father. I said, 5 years ago you wrote a letter to a man named Captain Morrison of the 5th Cavalry. You told him where this camp was. You told him how many people were here and how they moved and where they could be found before dawn when they would not have time to run. My father's mouth opened slightly. No sound came out. You called it a campaign, I said. He called it effective. 17 people died here, women and children among them. The word children felt like a stone in my mouth, heavy and specific and irrevocable. A man named Daniel Sleeping Bear lost his wife, I said. She was 20 years old. She used to sing while she worked, and now the days are too quiet. I heard behind me the faintest sound from Daniel. Not a word, just breath drawn in and held. Callum Strode shifted on his horse beside my father, his hand moving toward the pistol at his hip in a reflex that he caught and controlled before it completed itself. He was reading the camp, counting the warriors at the perimeter, doing the arithmetic that his instincts were insisting on. My father said Nora, just my name. The way he had said it when I was small and had done something he needed to correct, not angry, yet just calling my attention to the fact that a correction was coming. I said, do not. He stopped. I reached into my pocket, and I took out the letter, and I held it up so he could see it clearly, so he could see his own name on it, and Morrison's signature below, and the seal of the 5th Cavalry at the top. I found this the night I left, I said. I took it, because something in me knew it should not stay in your keeping. I have spent the last 3 weeks understanding what it means. My father looked at the letter in my hand. His face had gone the color of old paper. I said, there is a woman in this camp who was here in 1873. She saw you standing at the edge of the camp when the soldiers came. She heard your voice. She could not see your face well enough to name you, but she knew the seal on the papers you carried because she had seen it on your correspondence when you visited here 3 days before. 3 days, I said again, because I wanted him to hear the number. 3 days you spent in this camp before you went back to Harrow's Bend and wrote your letter to Captain Morrison. 3 days you ate their food and slept under their roofs and prayed over their children. My father's eyes closed briefly. When they opened again, something in them had changed. Some load-bearing structure that had been holding a particular shape for 5 years had finally given way under the weight of being seen. He said, I did not know they would kill people. I thought it was a matter of relocation. I thought they would simply be moved further west where there was less conflict with the settlers. I have heard people in the territory say those words before, he said, his voice dropping lower. I believed them because I wanted to believe them, because I needed the land along the Elkhorn, and Morrison told me it would be resolved peacefully, and I chose to believe that because not believing it would have required me to be a different man than I knew how to be. The honesty of it surprised me. I had expected denial or deflection or the particular kind of religious language that converts everything into the will of God and removes the human actor from the center of the act. I had not expected him to look at his own hands and describe what they had done. It did not make it better. I want to be clear about that. The admission did not repair anything or restore anything or change the shape of what had been lost. 17 people did not come back because my father had finally found the words for what he had done. Daniel's wife did not come back. Sage Woman's son did not come back. But it was real. It was the first real thing my father had said to me in longer than I could calculate. Behind me I was aware of movement not threatening, just the camp rearranging itself around what was happening. Chief Tall River had moved closer and was standing to my left listening. Young Hawk was somewhere at the perimeter. I could feel his presence without seeing it, like weather coming in from the north. Sage Woman had come out of her lodge and stood near its entrance, her arms at her sides, watching my father with an expression that was not hatred and was not forgiveness. It was witness. She was watching him the way you watch something that has needed to be seen for a long time and is finally being seen. And Daniel. Daniel had not moved from the 10 feet behind me, and I had not turned to look at him because I could not afford in that moment to see his face. I needed to finish this while I still had the architecture of my resolve intact, while the structure of what I had decided to do was still holding its shape against the weight of everything pressing on it. Callum Strode dismounted. He came toward me the way he always moved, with the careful, measured confidence of a man who believes the space he is moving into belongs to him as a matter of natural law. He stopped 3 feet from me, and he looked at me with an expression that was entirely sincere and entirely impenetrable. And he said, "Nora, come home. Whatever has happened here, whatever your father did, that is his to answer for. You do not need to carry it." I looked at him. I had known Callum Strode for 2 years. I had sat across tables from him and walked beside him through the streets of Harrow's Bend and felt his hand on my wrist in the front room of my father's house. I had tried and failed for most of those 2 years to name what was wrong with the picture he presented, because from the outside the picture was so correct, so entirely composed of the right elements arranged in the right configuration, that the thing that was wrong with it existed in a register too subtle for the language I had been given. I had the language now. He was not asking me to come home. He was telling me to come home using the grammatical form of a request. He was offering me the courtesy of framing what he required of me as something I was choosing, while making clear by every other signal available to him that the choice was already made, and my participation in the choosing was a formality he was extending to me out of what he understood as kindness. He believed this was love. That was the whole truth of it. He believed with a genuineness I could not dispute that knowing what was best for me and providing it whether or not I agreed was an expression of care. He had been taught this. It had been taught to him by people who had been taught it before him, handed down through generations, like furniture, useful and unremarkable and simply part of the house. I said, "Callum, I am not going back." He said, "Nora." I said, "I am not going back. I am staying here because this is where I choose to be. I am staying because these people have shown me more about what it means to be treated as a person capable of making her own decisions than I learned in 22 years in my father's house. I am staying because I have work here that matters, and because I am learning things I did not know I needed to know, and because for the first time in my life I feel the ground under my feet as something I am standing on rather than something I am trying not to fall through." He looked at me for a long moment with the expression of someone listening to a language they do not speak, hearing the sounds without being able to locate the meaning. Then he said, "I only ever wanted what was best for you." "I know," I said. And I did know. That was the part I had to hold alongside everything else, the same way Sage Woman had insisted I hold the full picture of my father. Callum was not pretending. His love, whatever it was real by the measure of his own understanding of the word, and that understanding was so profoundly different from what I now understood love to be capable of being that the same word could barely contain both versions. "I hope one day you understand the difference," I said, "between caring for someone and caring for the idea of someone, between love that makes space and love that fills it." He stared at me. Then he turned and walked back to his horse and mounted, and he looked at my father and said, "Thomas, This is beyond what I came here for." He rode south. He did not look back. The 3 men who had ridden with them exchanged a look and then without a word turned their horses and followed him, which was, I suppose, what men like that did when the person who had given them a reason to be somewhere was no longer there to provide one. I watched him go and felt something that was not relief and was not grief, but was somewhere between them, the particular feeling of watching a door close on a room. You know you will not enter again, the recognition that certain things do not resolve so much as they simply end. The camp was very still. I turned to face my father. He was still on his horse. He looked diminished up there, smaller than he had looked when they arrived, as though something structural had gone out of him, and he was being held in his current shape by habit rather than by anything still solid inside. I said, "There is something you need to do." He looked at me. "In Omaha there is a newspaper," I said. "The Herald. They have been investigating what happened in the territory in 1873. There are journalists there who have been trying to piece together what occurred and why and who knew what and when. If you go to them, if you give them a signed statement, a formal accounting of what you provided to Captain Morrison and when." My father was quiet. "It will not bring anyone back," I said. "I want to be clear that I know that. It will not be sufficient, and it will not be enough, and nothing you do from this point forward will constitute genuine repayment for what was taken. But it can create a record. It can make it harder for the Army to do this again in this part of the territory if there is a record that documents how the information was gathered and what it was used for. It can give the people who died here something they do not currently have, which is a named acknowledgement that what happened to them was not inevitable or accidental, but was arranged." My father said, "It will ruin me." "Yes," I said, "I imagine it will." He looked at his hands on the pommel of his saddle, the same large hands I had watched write sermons by lamplight since I was old enough to sit beside him and keep quiet. I had thought those hands were entirely familiar to me. I understood now that I had only ever known one version of them. He said, "Your mother used to say that a confession made before there is nothing left to lose is not courage. It is just arithmetic." "She was right," I said. He was quiet for a moment. "So this would be courage," he said. "It would be a start," I said. He dismounted. He stood on the ground in front of me, and he was just a man, not a reverend or a father or a moral authority or a figure of community standing, just a man in his late 50s with tired eyes and large hands and the weight of a 5-year-old decision that had never gotten lighter, no matter how many sermons he had preached on top of it. He said, "Will you come with me?" "To Omaha." "No," I said. He nodded. He had known that before he asked. He looked past me at the camp, at Sage Woman standing outside her lodge with her arms at her sides, at Chief Tall River beside me, at the camp itself, the lodges and the fires, and the ordinary life of a people who had survived what he had done to them. He said, "I would like to speak to the woman who lost her son." "That is not mine to arrange," I said. "That is between you and her." He nodded again. He led his horse past me into the camp. I watched him go, and I held the letter in my hand, and I felt the weight of it change, not disappear, but shift, the way the weight of a thing changes when you have done what you were going to do with it, and it passes from potential into something already accomplished, and therefore fixed. It was done. Whatever came next, this part was done. I felt a presence beside me and looked up to find Daniel standing there. He had come around from behind without my hearing him, which with Daniel meant he had chosen not to be heard. He stood beside me, and we both watched my father cross the camp toward Sage Woman's lodge. After a long time, Daniel said, "You knew when you showed me the letter what it would mean." "Yes," I said. He said, "You showed me anyway." "Yes." He was quiet for another moment. "Why?" he said. "You could have burned it. You could have said nothing. You had every reason to protect yourself." "Because it was not mine to keep," I said. "I said the same thing to you when I gave it to you, and I mean the same thing now. The secret did not belong to me. The people it belonged to were the ones it was taken from." He looked at me then fully and directly the way he had looked at me on the first morning in the grass, with that reading expression that was trying to understand something rather than simply observe it. He said, "What will you do now?" I said, "I do not know yet. I only know I am not leaving." He said, even with what you know about your father, about what he did here, you would stay among the people he harmed. I said I would stay among the people who showed me that harm does not have to be the whole story, that you can carry what was done to you without letting it determine everything you do next. I have watched Sage Woman do that every morning for 3 weeks. I would like to learn how she does it. Daniel looked back toward the camp. She would say there is no method, he said. She would say you simply decide each morning that the grief is yours and the life is also yours, and you are not required to choose between them. I thought about that. Then I thought about the letter now in Daniel's hand, the proof, the foundation of whatever came next. I said, young hawk, he has been waiting for something to happen. He is going to need to know. Daniel said, I will speak to him. He paused. He said what you did this morning, standing in front of your father, speaking first. He did not finish the sentence. He did not need to. I said I was terrified. He said, I know. I was standing behind you. I could see your hands. I looked down at my hands. They were steady now. I said, I have been terrified most of my life. I am trying to learn the difference between terror that is telling me something true and terror that is just the sound of the cage I grew up in rattling around in my chest because it does not know yet that the door is open. Daniel said nothing for a moment. Then he said, that is a very good distinction. And we stood together in the afternoon light while my father walked toward Sage Woman's lodge, and the camp moved around us in its ordinary rhythms, and the prairie wind came in from the north with the smell of coming autumn in it, cold and clean and enormous. 2 months passed between the afternoon my father rode south toward Omaha and the Tuesday in November when his name appeared in print. In the way that time passes when a person is fully occupied with living rather than merely enduring, those 2 months did not feel short, but they did not feel long. They felt for the first time in my memory like they belonged to me, like each day was a thing I was spending rather than something being spent on me. The story of Reverend Thomas Hallett and Captain R. Morrison and the campaign in the Elkhorn River country appeared in the Omaha Herald on a Tuesday in November in a column on the front page below the fold. Daniel's contact at the paper, the journalist he had worked with 2 years prior as a translator, had taken my father's signed statement and combined it with the letter and with a written account from Sage Woman, translated by Daniel, and had built from these materials a piece of journalism that was specific and documented and could not be easily dismissed as sentiment or partisanship. The article named names. It described dates and locations. It quoted the letter directly and compared its language to the Army's own records of the action which the journalist had obtained through a contact in the War Department in Washington. It established in the dry and precise language of reportage that the settlement in the Elkhorn River country had not been a spontaneous military action but a planned operation enabled by civilian intelligence gathering, and that the civilian who had gathered and provided that intelligence was a minister of the gospel in the Nebraska Territory who had subsequently continued to live in the community he had betrayed without accountability or consequence. Captain Morrison was recalled to Washington for inquiry. The inquiry lasted 3 months and resulted in a formal censure and reassignment. It was not sufficient. I want to be honest about that. A censure and a reassignment were not commensurate with 17 deaths and 5 years of carried grief and all the damage that radiated outward from those deaths into the lives of everyone who had loved those people. No formal proceeding was going to be commensurate. The mathematics of institutional accountability and the mathematics of actual human loss have never yet been made to correspond. But the article existed. The record existed. The names of the dead were printed in a newspaper that was read in Washington, and the mechanism by which they had been made to die was described in enough detail that it could not be easily reproduced without someone somewhere having the awareness that it had been done before and had been documented. Chief Tall River said when Daniel translated the article for him that the truth printed on paper has a longer life than the truth held in memory, because memory dies with the person who carries it, and paper can outlast a generation. He said this was why his uncle's uncle had always been suspicious of the value of literacy, because once a people's stories are written down, they pass out of the control of those who lived them and into the hands of whoever holds the pen. But he also said that in this particular case, in this particular moment, the pen had been pointed in a useful direction, and he would accept that as the partial remedy it was without pretending it was the whole one. My father left Nebraska 2 weeks after he gave his statement to the Herald. He went east to a sister he had in Ohio, a woman I had met twice as a child and remembered only as someone with my father's hands and a different way of using them. He did not write to me before he left. I learned of his departure from Daniel, who learned it from young Hawk, who had maintained his contact in Harrow's Bend and continued to receive information from that direction. I did not know what I felt about my father's leaving. I am still not entirely certain I know. There is a kind of grief that does not announce itself clearly, that does not feel like grief in the ordinary sense of the word, but lives in the body as a low, continuous ache present on waking and present at sleep and present in the middle of ordinary activities. The grief of losing something you never fully had, of mourning a version of a person that existed alongside the real one without ever quite replacing it. I had loved my father. I believed I still did, in the way that you love a place you grew up in that turned out to be built on unstable ground. The love is real. It does not require that the ground was stable. That afternoon, I helped Sage Woman stretch a new hide on the frame I had built myself 3 weeks prior, using the method she had shown me in the first week, and then left me to practice alone. My hands knew the work now in a way they had not known it before, not thinking about the angle or the pressure, just moving. Sage Woman watched me for a moment and then went back to her own work without comment, which from her was the highest possible form of approval. Afterward, I sat outside my lodge and worked on the moccasins I had been beading for 2 weeks, a pair sized for Daniel, the pattern along the edge one I had designed myself after enough practice that I trusted my own eye. The camp moved around me in its ordinary evening rhythms. Children came back from wherever children go during the long hours of the afternoon. Fires were built up. The smell of cooking spread outward from the center of the camp in a way that reached you before you were aware of being hungry and made you aware of it immediately. I belong to all of this now in the particular way you belong to things you have chosen rather than things you were born into. Not without remainder, not perfectly, but genuinely, which counted for more. Sage Woman met with my father once before he left. I do not know what passed between them. It was not mine to know. I know only that my father was in her lodge for approximately an hour, and that when he emerged he looked like a man who had set down something very heavy and would now have to learn to walk differently to account for the absence of the weight. Whether that change persisted or whether it dissipated in Ohio with enough time and distance, I cannot tell you. I only saw him that once more briefly as he mounted his horse to leave. He looked at me across the camp. He said, "Be well, Nora." I said, "Goodbye, Father." It was not forgiveness. It was not the absence of forgiveness either. It was something more specific and more honest than either of those, which was acknowledgement. I saw him. I saw the full picture of him, the man who had loved me and the man who had written a letter to a cavalry captain, and I released neither version of him and condemned neither version of him and simply let him be the complicated and damaged and real person he was walking out of the camp on his horse in the November light. Sage Woman came to stand beside me as he rode south. She did not say anything for a long time. Then she said, "I told him the name of my son." I looked at her. "He should know the name," she said. "A person should know the name of the person they are accountable for. Names make things real in a way that numbers do not." I said, "What did he say?" She said, "He said the name back to me. He said it the way you say a word when you are trying to memorize it, like he intended to carry it." She picked up the basket she had brought outside with her and went back to her work. I stood for another moment in the place where my father had last been visible, and then I turned back into the camp and went to find Daniel. I found him at the horses, which was where I usually found him in the late afternoon. He had been working with a young colt that belonged to one of the families in camp, a horse that was still uncertain in its training and required patience that Daniel had an apparently inexhaustible supply. He was standing with the colt at the end of a long lead, not pulling, not directing, simply being present and letting the animal decide on its own terms when it was ready to approach. He heard me coming and looked over his shoulder and then looked back at the colt. "He is gone," I said. "I know," Daniel said. The colt took 3 steps toward him and stopped. Daniel did not move. I said, "Young Hawk came to find me this morning. He said he is leaving next week with a group going north. He said to tell you he is sorry he did not come to you first." Daniel was quiet for a moment. The colt took another step. "I will speak to him before he goes," Daniel said. "There is nothing to be sorry for. He made the decision he thought was right with what he understood at the time. That is all any person can do." He paused. "He said my uncle says the same of your father." I looked at him. "Chief Tall River," he said. "He said your father made the decision he thought was right with what he was willing to understand at the time. He says the failure was not in the deciding but in the limiting of what he was willing to understand. He says this is the most common kind of failure and the hardest to correct because it requires a person to expand what they will allow themselves to see, and most people find the edges of their vision more comfortable than the expansion." The colt walked the remaining distance to Daniel and pushed its nose against his shoulder, and Daniel raised his hand and rested it on the animal's neck, steady and unhurried. He said, "My uncle also said something else." I waited. "He said that you have been here long enough that you should be called something here, that your name should have a place in the language of this camp if this camp is to be your home." I felt something move in my chest. Daniel turned from the colt to look at me directly. There was something different in his face, not the careful, controlled neutrality he maintained as a default, but something that had been allowed through the surface, something that was looking at me and not trying to translate itself into anything more manageable than what it was. He suggested, "Wing Yang Shkong Shkong." It means something like a woman who moves with purpose, a woman who acts. I said nothing. My throat had closed around whatever I might have said. He said I thought it was accurate. After a moment he said, "There is also something I want to say to you that is not from my uncle." He dropped the colt's lead and the animal stood quietly without it, which was progress. He turned to face me fully. He said, "I have been careful with you since the day I found you in the grass. I have been careful because you needed that from me, and because it was right, and because I knew that what you were coming from required that anyone near you be a person who understood the meaning of the word careful." He paused. "I am still that person," he said. "I want to be clear that I am still that person, and that nothing I am about to say changes what I have promised you." He looked at me with that reading expression steady and open. He said, "But I would like to stop being only careful." The prairie wind moved through the camp around us, bending the grass at the edge of the open ground in long, slow waves, and somewhere in the camp behind me a child was laughing at something, a high, clear sound that went up into the November sky and disappeared. I said, "Daniel." He waited. I said, "The night you found me in the grass. I was sitting there because I did not know which direction was safe. I had run north because north was the only direction that was not the direction I had come from, which was the direction of everything I knew was wrong. I was not running toward anything. I was just running away." He nodded. I said, "I am not running away anymore." He was very still. I said, "I am staying here because I choose to stay here. I am staying because this camp has given me the first 3 months of my life in which I have been treated as a person whose preferences are real and whose voice is worth hearing, and whose decisions belong to her. I am staying because Sage Woman has been teaching me something every morning that I do not have a single word for, something about how to carry grief and also carry hope in the same body at the same time, without one of them destroying the other." I took a breath. I said, "And I am staying because of you. Not because you saved me. You have been clear from the beginning that I saved myself, and I believe you. But because of the way you walk 10 feet behind me when we are somewhere new, until I have had time to read the space. Because of the way you explain reasons instead of just issuing instructions. Because of the way you sat at the creek on the 19th night and told me about your wife's singing, without asking me to carry it for you, just sharing it, because that is what people who trust each other do." Daniel said my name very quietly. I said, "I know what you lost. I know that what you feel for the woman you lost is real and permanent, and is not something that gets replaced. I am not asking you to replace anything. I am asking if there is space alongside what will always be there for something new, for something that does not diminish what came before but exists in its own right. The colt wandered a few steps away and began pulling at the dry grass near the fence post, indifferent to the conversation in the way that animals are indifferent to the conversations of people, which is one of the things that makes them easy to be around. Daniel said, "The day I found you, I had been out since before dawn. I could not sleep." I said nothing. He said, "I have not slept well since 1873. You know that." But that morning was different. That morning I had woken from a dream about the camp, about the way it looked after, and I had gone out because I could not stay inside the lodge with the weight of it. I rode south. I rode further south than I usually ride. He looked at me steadily. He said, "I do not say this to make it into something it might not be. I only say it because you were honest with me, and honesty seems like the right register for this conversation. But I was further south than I had any particular reason to be, and you were there, and the direction you were walking was north." I held that for a moment. I said, "I do not think that makes it inevitable. I think we still had to choose it. Are still choosing it." He said, "Yes, I think so too." He said, "I am choosing it." The afternoon light had shifted while we were talking, the way Nebraska light shifts in November from gold to amber to the thin blue of approaching evening, the colors moving across the prairie in slow, transparent layers. The horses in the corral moved and breathed, and the camp behind us was settling into its evening rhythms, fires being built up and food being prepared, and the ordinary domestic sounds of people ending one part of the day and beginning another. I said, "Chief Tall River will want to be consulted." "About this, about the arrangements." Daniel said he already knows. I stared at him. He said, "My uncle sees things before they happen. He has always been this way. It is deeply inconvenient." There was something in his voice that I had been learning to recognize over 3 months, a very dry and very contained quality that was as close as Daniel's sleeping bear usually came to humor. I had come to value it in the way you come to value things that are rare and offered without advertisement. I said, "That is deeply inconvenient." He said, "He will want a formal occasion. He will want witnesses. He will want the thing done correctly, which means done in the way of his people and with the full acknowledgement of the camp." I said, "That sounds right to me." He said, "It will take some weeks to arrange. There are people to be consulted and preparations to be made. In the meantime—" He paused. He reached out and took my hand. He did it the way he did everything, without hurry, in full view, with a deliberateness that made it unmistakably a choice and not an accident or an imposition. "In the meantime," he said, "I would like to walk with you in the evenings, if you are willing." I looked at his hand around mine. The scar on his wrist was visible, the old binding mark pale and permanent. My own hand had calluses now from the hide work and the outdoor labor, the hands of someone who had been doing physical things in an outdoor life, not the soft, careful hands I had maintained in Harrow's Bend, as though they were a symbol of a refinement that had never felt like mine. I said, "I am willing." We walked out to the edge of camp together into the open prairie, into the last of the November evening light, and we walked without particular destination, in a direction that was simply outward, into the space that the territory offered, enormous and indifferent and beautiful, in the way that things are beautiful when they do not require anything from you. He pointed out a hawk riding a thermal far above us, barely moving, sustained in the air by something invisible. We walked until the light was nearly gone, and the first stars were becoming visible in the eastern sky, the advance party of the night's full complement, arriving early in their usual positions. Then we turned and walked back toward the fires of the camp. I want to tell you about the morning that came after, because it is the morning I think of when I think about what it means to have chosen a life rather than simply occupied one. I woke early in the lodge that was still mine, alone in the dark, before the camp had fully stirred. I lay for a moment in the warmth of the buffalo robes and listened to the Nebraska morning assembling itself outside. The wind was low and steady. A bird was calling from somewhere near the creek, a sound I had learned to identify over 3 months of mornings, a meadowlark, which is the bird that seems to believe it is responsible for announcing the day. I dressed and went outside. The sky to the east was just beginning to differentiate itself from the darkness. A thin line of lighter dark along the horizon, the suggestion of something coming. Sage Woman was already up, as she always was, sitting outside her lodge with her morning tea. She looked at me, and looked at the horizon, and looked back at me, and said nothing, which was her way of saying she had already added this morning to the pattern she was watching and approved of what she saw. I sat down beside her and we watched the sky together. The light came the way it always does on the Nebraska prairie, not suddenly, but with a gathering momentum, each minute a little more color added to the horizon. Amber, and then rose, and then a thin, brilliant line of gold where the sun was preparing to appear. I thought about the letter that was no longer in my pocket. I thought about my father riding east through the November cold toward Ohio, carrying a name he had been given to remember. I thought about Callum Strode back in Harrow's Bend, living the life he understood, possibly unchanged, and possibly in the private accounting of his own interior, beginning the long, slow work of questioning something he had never before thought to question. I could not know which. I had given up the idea that I could know. I thought about Daniel. I thought about what it had felt like to walk beside him in the evening light, not behind him, not ahead of him, but beside him at the same pace in the same direction with the same view of the same horizon. The sun came up. It cleared the horizon in that particular way it has in November on the open prairie without ceremony, just the slow revelation of itself, and the light moved across the grass in a wave, gold and then ordinary, the extraordinary duration of a sunrise reduced to seconds, and then the day had simply begun and was already becoming itself. Sage Woman said, "My son's name was Flies Straight." I looked at her. She said, "I have not said his name to you before. I tell you now because you have earned it, because you acted for his memory even before you knew his name, which is the rarer kind of action and the more trustworthy." I said his name quietly. Flies Straight. She nodded. She said he was 17 when he died. He was going to be a good man. I knew this because he was already asking the right questions, which is what good men do before they become fully good. They question things. They make you tired with their questioning, and then later you understand that the questioning was how they were building themselves into something worth having. She looked at her tea. She said, "I think you know something about asking the right questions." I thought about a flower in the dark on the prairie before dawn, and the question it had opened in me that I was still answering. I said, "I am learning." She said, "Yes, I can see that." The camp was waking up around us, the morning sounds beginning, and somewhere across the camp I could hear Daniel's voice speaking to someone in Lakota, his tone patient and unhurried as it always was. I stood up. I said, "Thank you, Sage Woman, for everything you have taught me, for the mornings you did not ask me questions, and the mornings you did, for telling me his name." She waved her hand as though swatting something away, which was her gesture for do not make a ceremony of ordinary things. "Go do something useful," she said. "The hides do not scrape themselves." I laughed. It came out of me naturally and fully, and without any of the careful management I had once applied to my own expressions in public spaces, the monitoring and the editing and the presenting of a version of myself that would not inconvenience anyone. I walked across the camp toward the work of the day. I passed young Hawk, who was packing his gear for the journey north, and he looked up at me and said, "She will be called Wing Yang Skong." I heard what my uncle decided. It is a good name. I said, "Thank you, young Hawk. Travel safely." He said, "I will come back in the spring." He said it simply the way you state a fact that does not require emphasis, because it is true. I said, "I will be here." He nodded and went back to his packing. I kept walking. The morning spread itself out across the camp in all its ordinary detail, the fires and the horses and the work and the voices, the life of a people who had survived what they had survived and were continuing to live with a thoroughness and a completeness that I was still learning to read fully. I was part of it now. Not completely, not without remainder. There were things I would always be learning, and dimensions of this life I would never fully inhabit because I had not grown up inside it. But I was part of it in the way that a person can be part of something they chose, which is a different kind of belonging than the belonging that comes from birth, but is not lesser for that. It is in some ways the more deliberate kind. I found the hide I had been working on stretched on its frame at the edge of the work area, and I picked up my scraping tool and I set my hands to it, and I began. Outside the camp, the prairie stretched in every direction, enormous and various and full of the small, specific life that I was only beginning to have the eyes to see. The meadowlark was still singing somewhere I could not locate it. The wind moved through the grass in its long, rhythmic patterns, constant as breathing. Somewhere behind me, Daniel's voice continued its patient work. I worked through the morning. That is not a small thing. I know it does not sound like much in the accounting of a life to say that a woman worked through a morning, but for 22 years I had worked through mornings in a house that was not mine for purposes that were not mine, and the work had accumulated without becoming anything that belonged to me. Here the accumulation was different. Here each morning's work built on the morning before it and was building towards something I could begin to see and outline, a life made of chosen things, of skills earned and relationships entered into, honestly, and mornings belonging to me in the full and simple sense that I was the one deciding what to do with them. It is enough, I told myself. It is more than enough. It is, in fact, everything. The sun rose higher, and the morning became afternoon, and the meadowlark stopped singing, and the wind kept on steady and enormous and indifferent and magnificent, the way the prairie wind always is, the way it was the morning I walked out into it with nothing but a stolen letter and a decision I had not yet finished making. I had finished making it now. Every morning I would finish making it again. That is what it means to choose a life rather than occupy one. Not a single decision made once and permanently. A decision made again each morning in the particular light of that particular day, with full knowledge of what it costs and clear sight of what it gives in return. I chose this morning. I would choose the next one, and the one after that. The prairie wind moved through the grass and the camp lived around me in its ordinary fullness, and I set my hands to the work, and I stayed.